The Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun earned its nickname Madus for good reason. When John Moses Browning finalized the design in 1921, he created what military historians still call the most successful heavy machine gun in history. This weapon could punch through engine blocks at 500 yards, tear apart light armor, and send a half-inch diameter projectile screaming downrange at 2,910 feet per second. By 1942, every American infantry company in the Pacific wanted as many of these monsters as they could get. The psychological impact alone was worth its weight in gold. Japanese soldiers called it the woodpecker of death because of its distinctive firing rhythm. A slow, thunderous thump, thump, thump that sent entire squads diving for cover. But here's what the recruiting posters never mentioned. The M2 had a fatal flaw that every machine gunner learned to fear. The weapon could theoretically fire 450 to 600 rounds per minute, but in practice, you had maybe 90 to 120 seconds of sustained fire before the laws of physics turned your best friend into a useless hunk of metal. The barrel, glowing cherry red, would warp from the heat. Rounds might cook off, firing on their own without the trigger being pulled, and if you didn't stop in time, the entire receiver could seize up. In the chaos of a jungle firefight or a beach assault, that meant death, for you and everyone depending on your covering fire. So, when one young gunner claimed he had figured out a way to keep his Madus firing non-stop, not for seconds but for 10 straight minutes, no one believed him. What he did next would become one of the wildest, most ingenious moments in the history of machine warfare, born from desperation, courage, and pure American improvisation. The story begins on a blistering August morning in 1943, somewhere in the South Pacific. The Marines of the 1st Battalion, 9th Regiment, the Walking Dead, were dug in along a muddy ridgeline outside Bougainville. Japanese mortars were zeroing in, and enemy machine guns had the Americans pinned. The air was thick with humidity, gunpowder, and fear. Among the Marines was Corporal Frank Blakely, a 22-year-old farm kid from Kansas. Frank wasn't the biggest man in his unit, but behind the twin handles of a Browning M2, he became something else entirely. His buddies joked that he treated the gun like a living thing, cleaning it, talking to it, even patting the receiver after every firefight as if thanking it for keeping him alive. But Blakely knew the truth. His Madus was as dangerous to him as it was to the enemy. He'd already seen a gunner in his platoon burn through a barrel so hot that it drooped like soft lead. The gun locked up, and when the Japanese counterattacked, that poor kid never made it back. Frank couldn't get that image out of his mind. He started thinking, obsessing really, about how to keep the M2 firing longer. He knew that replacing barrels in combat was risky. The heat, the chaos, the smoke, it was too easy to fumble. What if, instead of replacing the barrel, he could somehow cool it down fast enough to keep firing continuously? Back home, he'd worked on tractors and engines. He understood heat, he understood metal, and he knew one thing for sure. Metal only melts if it can't shed heat fast enough. That night, after another brutal firefight, he scavenged through the camp's scrap pile. Old canteens, spare fuel drums, broken pipes. His fellow Marines thought he'd lost it. "Blakely's building a submarine," one of them joked. But he wasn't laughing. He was sketching something, a crude diagram of what looked like a water jacket, like those used on early machine guns from World War I. He didn't have the luxury of factory parts or engineering tools, but he had determination, a combat knife, and a few battered pieces of equipment. Over the next few days, he tinkered whenever there was a lull in the fighting. He used metal tubing from a wrecked Jeep and sealed it with melted rubber from a spare tire. He attached the contraption to the barrel sleeve of his M2 and filled it with water from his canteen. When the sergeant saw what he'd done, he shook his head. "You're gonna blow yourself up, Blakely." But Frank just smiled. "Maybe. Or maybe I'll make her sing longer than she's ever sung before." That night, as the Japanese prepared for another wave attack, Frank's experimental M2 sat ready on the ridge. The rest of the platoon whispered, nervously watching the moonlit jungle ahead. They didn't know it yet. But what was about to happen would defy everything they'd been taught about machine guns, heat, and human endurance. Before we move on to what happens next, make sure you're subscribed for more stories like this, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The first shots came just after midnight. A Japanese flare burst overhead, washing the jungle in an eerie blue light. For a split second, the entire ridge looked like a frozen photograph. The black silhouettes of palm trees, the jagged outlines of helmets, and Frank Blakely crouched behind his Browning M2, his hands gripping the butterfly triggers. Then the jungle erupted. Mortar shells thudded into the mud. Machine gun fire raked across the American lines. The Japanese were charging uphill, screaming, firing as they came. Frank waited until he could see movement through the brush. Then he squeezed the triggers. The Browning came to life with a thunderous rhythm, the heavy round shredding the undergrowth and cutting down anything that moved. The muzzle flash lit up Frank's face in bursts of orange, and for a while, the world became nothing but noise. The metallic roar of his weapon, the smell of cordite, and the shouted commands of his sergeant trying to direct the defense. The gun never faltered. It just kept firing. At first, Frank didn't even notice. He was in that strange zone soldiers sometimes describe. Total focus, total clarity. He was firing in long bursts, then steady streams, adjusting his aim with each tracer that arced through the night sky. The Japanese kept coming, and his Madus kept answering. After 3 minutes, the barrel should have been smoking white-hot. After 5, it should have been glowing red, cooking off rounds on its own. But somehow, impossibly, it wasn't. The water jacket he'd built from scavenged parts was working. Steam hissed from the seams, droplets sizzling on the metal like rain on a stove, but the gun stayed operational. "Blakely, swap barrels," his sergeant yelled. Frank didn't respond. He just kept firing. "God damn it, Blakely, that thing's gonna melt." But it didn't. 10 minutes passed. 10 full minutes of sustained fire, an eternity in machine gun time. The barrel smoked, yes, but it never warped. His makeshift cooling system kept the weapon alive. The Marines around him could hardly believe it. One of them started shouting, "Keep it going! Keep it going!" The Japanese charge broke. The hillside was littered with craters and shattered bamboo. The surviving attackers melted back into the jungle, dragging their wounded with them. The night went quiet, except for the ticking sound of cooling metal. Frank finally lifted his hands from the grips, his arms trembling from the effort. The water in his cooling rig had completely boiled off, leaving behind a cloud of steam that drifted in the humid air. His M2 was blackened and battered, but still functional. His squad crowded around, staring at the gun like it was something holy. "How the hell did you keep it from melting?" one Marine asked. Frank gave a tired grin. "I didn't stop shooting long enough to let it think about it." When dawn came, the sergeant inspected the weapon himself. Aside from a few warped edges on the jacket, it was in perfect condition. Frank had done what every manual said was impossible. Sustained continuous fire for 10 full minutes from a .50 caliber Browning without a barrel change. Word of his crazy trick spread through the battalion like wildfire. Some called it luck, others called it genius, but everyone agreed on one thing. No one had ever seen a gunner do what Frank Blakely did that night on Bougainville. And for the first time in his life, the quiet farm boy from Kansas felt like a legend in the making. By the next morning, stories about Blakely's 10-minute burst were circulating through every tent in the company. The sergeant had already filed his after-action report. But when it reached battalion headquarters, the officers thought it was exaggerated. 10 minutes of continuous fire from a Browning M2? Impossible. Every field manual said the barrel would fail after 2. The company commander, Captain Harlan Price, decided to see it for himself. He ordered Blakely to bring his machine gun to the makeshift range behind camp. The M2 sat on its tripod like a black steel animal, scarred from the night's battle. The improvised water jacket still clung to the barrel, dented and soot-stained, with bits of rubber hanging off where the seams had boiled open. Captain Price folded his arms. "You really claim this contraption kept the barrel from overheating?" "Yes, sir," Blakely said. "It ain't pretty, but it works." The captain raised an eyebrow. "Show me." A small crowd of Marines gathered, curious and skeptical. Ammunition belts were lined up on a tarp, nearly 3,000 rounds. Blakely filled his makeshift cooling jacket again, checked the headspace, and nodded to the loader. When he squeezed the triggers, the familiar thump-thump-thump echoed across the clearing. At first, everyone just watched, unimpressed. 2 minutes passed, the standard limit, then 3. The barrel glowed dull red, steam hissing out from the seams. At 5 minutes, the captain's skeptical expression turned to astonishment. By 7, the crowd was cheering him on. When Blakely finally released the trigger after a full 10 minutes, he stood in a cloud of steam, grinning like a madman. The gun hadn't jammed. The barrel hadn't melted. It was still operational. Captain Price knelt to inspect it. "You're telling me this was made from Jeep parts and a tire?" "Yes, sir," Blakely said. "Kansas Engineering." Price laughed, shaking his head. "You just made every ordnance officer in the Army look like an idiot." The test results were sent up the chain of command. Within weeks, ordnance officers from the 3rd Marine Division were flown in to examine the modified M2. They ran their own tests, confirming what Blakely had shown. His improvised system actually worked. Word reached headquarters in Hawaii, then Washington. The Army Ordnance Department demanded blueprints. There were none, just a grease-stained sketch in Blakely's field notebook. They tried replicating it using proper machine shop tools, but the first few models failed. It turned out that Blakely's success wasn't just his design. It was the way he had assembled it. The loose fittings, the irregular metal seams, even the melted rubber from the tire had created a primitive pressure release system that kept the water circulating as it boiled. An accident of improvisation, born in a war zone, had outperformed years of official research. Soon, the nickname started spreading, Blakely's Crazy Cooler. Marines joked that if it didn't explode, it would probably outlive them all. But behind the humor, there was a growing respect, even reverence, for the kid who had refused to accept the limits everyone else lived by. The press never covered it. Official reports buried it in technical jargon, but among the men who fought and bled beside him, Frank Blakely became a symbol of what American ingenuity looked like in the rawest, most desperate moments of war. And as the Pacific Campaign moved toward its bloodiest battles, that same ingenuity would soon be tested in ways Blakely could never have imagined. By September 1944, Corporal Frank Blakely and his unit had been reassigned to Peleliu, a small, coral island in the Palau chain that the U.S. military believed would take just a few days to capture. It took over 2 months. The place was a nightmare. 115-degree heat, blinding white coral, and Japanese defenders dug into caves and tunnels that turned the entire island into a fortress. For Blakely, the terrain meant one thing. His Browning M2 would once again be the difference between life and death. His cooling system, now reinforced with metal tubing from a wrecked landing craft, had been officially approved for field testing. His squad was one of only a handful carrying the Blakely rig, though most of the brass still thought it was too unreliable for wide use. On the morning of September 17th, his platoon advanced along the airfield under a relentless sun. The smell of cordite and decaying coral filled the air. From the ridges ahead, Japanese heavy machine guns opened fire, cutting through the first wave of Marines. The order came through: suppress those positions at all costs. Blakely and his assistant gunner, Private Red Dalton, set up their Browning behind a wrecked amphibious tractor. Frank's fingers tightened on the grips. The first burst echoed across the open runway, kicking up dust and smoke. The Japanese gunners answered immediately, bullets snapping through the air like angry hornets. "Keep her steady, Red," Frank shouted. The M2 roared, tracing a curtain of fire across the ridge. Normally, he'd have to pause every minute to cool down the barrel, but not this time. He kept firing, sweeping the line, methodical and relentless. The Japanese gunners couldn't return fire effectively. Every time one tried to pop up, Frank's tracers found them. Marines moved forward behind the deadly rhythm of his weapon. After 5 minutes, Red shouted, "She's smoking, Frank!" "I know," Frank yelled back. Steam poured from the barrel jacket, but the gun didn't seize. 10 minutes, 11, 12. The impossible was happening again. By the time their ammo belts ran dry, the entire ridge was silent except for the crackle of burning brush. The platoon pushed forward, securing the position. When they reached the top, the Marines found dozens of destroyed emplacements. One of the officers looked at Blakely's M2 and whistled. "That thing's still running?" Frank gave a tired grin. "Just getting warmed up, sir." But the victory came at a cost. Dalton had taken shrapnel to his shoulder, and 2 of the squad's riflemen were gone. Blakely sat beside his gun as medics worked on the wounded, his hands blackened from soot and oil. For the first time, the weight of what he'd done and what it had cost began to sink in. Later that night, under a blood-red sunset, Frank wrote in his field notebook, "The trick works. The gun stays cool enough, but maybe the real trick is not letting the fire get to you." That page would later be found by a war correspondent, who would call it the diary of a man who refused to quit. Before we move on to what happened next, make sure you're subscribed for more stories like this, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because on Peleliu, Frank Blakely's invention had turned him into a hero, but in the next battle, it would test his courage in a way no machine ever could. When the colonel heard about Private Avery's cooling contraption, he didn't believe a word of it. "No machine gun fires 10 minutes straight without warping the barrel," he barked. But curiosity got the better of him. The next morning, Avery and his squad were ordered to the firing range for a demonstration. Word spread fast. Mechanics, armorers, and even the battalion commander came out to see if this farm boy's Frankenstein setup could actually defy physics. Avery stood beside his beloved Browning M2, the barrel gleaming under the Pacific sun. He had modified the cooling can to perfection overnight, adding a small vent to release excess pressure and a funnel for faster refills. The weapon looked absurd: hoses, tape, and a dripping bucket connected to a gun that was never meant to need a water bath. But Avery didn't care how it looked. As long as she runs cool, he said, patting the receiver. She'll sing for as long as I feed her. The colonel gave the order. All right, son. Let's see what you've got. Avery loaded a fresh belt, 100 rounds of 50 caliber Fury. The first burst roared to life, echoing across the beach. Empty shells clinked and danced in the sand. After a full minute, the barrel should have been glowing red, but steam hissed steadily from the cooling canister. 5 minutes in, still no jam. The colonel's eyebrows rose. At 7 minutes, one of the mechanics shouted, "This is impossible!" She should have seized by now. Avery grinned, sweat dripping down his face as he kept his finger on the butterfly trigger. The sound of the Madus never faltered, steady, rhythmic, terrifying. 9 minutes and 40 seconds. The ammo belts ran dry. The range fell silent except for the faint hiss of steam escaping from the cooling rig. Avery stepped back, barrel smoking lightly but intact. The colonel walked up, resting his hand on the weapon's receiver. It was warm but nowhere near molten. 10 minutes, he muttered, almost in disbelief. You just did what every ordnance engineer said couldn't be done. The crowd erupted in cheers. Soldiers slapped Avery on the back. Someone yelled, "Madus never sleeps," and the name stuck. From that day, Avery's field-cooled Browning became a legend across the regiment. That night, the colonel summoned Avery to his tent. "Son," he said, lighting his pipe, "you might have just changed the way we fight. Write down exactly how you built that contraption. Command's gonna want to see this." Avery hesitated. "With respect, sir, it's just a bucket and some tubing. Nothing special," the colonel smiled. "Sometimes the simplest ideas save the most lives." Before we move on to what happens next, subscribe for more stories like this, and let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? 2 weeks later, Avery's invention faced its true test, not on a firing range, but in the chaos of war. The 24th Infantry Division had been pinned down on a ridge overlooking a jungle valley. Japanese forces had dug into fortified bunkers below, and every attempt to advance was shredded by machine gun nests and mortar fire. The air was thick with humidity, the smell of cordite, and fear. Sergeant Avery crouched behind a sandbag wall, his modified M2 mounted on a tripod. His assistant gunner, Corporal Mills, was feeding fresh belts into the receiver. "We're low on ammo, Sarge!" Mills shouted over the thunder of explosions. "We've got maybe 8 belts left." "That's 800 reasons for them to keep their heads down," Avery replied, tightening the coolant hose. "Let's make 'em count. When the order came, suppress those nests." Avery pressed the butterfly trigger. The Browning roared to life, its familiar thudding echoing through the jungle. The recoil vibrated through his shoulders, but the gun didn't slow. Steam hissed steadily from the cooling canister, creating a thin veil of mist around the weapon. It looked almost alive, breathing under pressure. Minute after minute, Avery kept firing controlled bursts, stitching lines of tracer fire into the enemy's bunkers. The Japanese gunners returned fire, bullets snapping through palm leaves overhead, but the M2 kept hammering away. Mills shouted, "She's still running cool!" At the 5-minute mark, something incredible happened. The enemy guns went silent. The relentless rhythm of the Madus had overwhelmed them. Allied troops seized the moment, charging down the ridge. Avery switched barrels mid-battle, refilled the water can, and resumed fire like clockwork. Captain Howard ran past, yelling, "Keep that gun hot, Avery!" "Hot! She's colder than your coffee, sir!" Avery yelled back with a grin. By the time the smoke cleared, the ridge was secure. Over 30 enemy positions had been silenced. Avery's gun never once jammed or overheated. Soldiers later said the constant sound of the Madus was like a heartbeat, the rhythm of survival. When the medics and engineers arrived, they couldn't believe what they saw. The barrel was blackened but intact. The cooling bucket, dented by shrapnel, still dripped warm water. The improvised setup had done what military engineers had declared impossible. After the battle, word spread fast. Commanders began sending telegrams up the chain. Request field adaptation of Avery cooling system. Immediate combat benefit observed. But while the officers debated and the engineers scribbled notes, Avery sat quietly on an ammo crate, staring at the steam curling from his weapon. Mills handed him a canteen. "You did it, Sarge. You proved it works." Avery just nodded. It wasn't about proving it works. It was about keeping them alive. The next morning, a lieutenant arrived with orders. "Sergeant Avery, you're being reassigned to the Ordnance Corps. They want your design on paper. You'll be working with the engineers." Avery looked down at his gun, the patched-up monster that had saved his unit, and sighed. "I built her for the fight, not for the lab." Before we move on to what happened next, make sure you're subscribed for more incredible true war stories like this, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Back at the division headquarters, Avery's field-made cooling rig caused a quiet storm among the engineers. The ordnance tent buzzed with curiosity as the mud-streaked Browning sat on a steel table, its hose, can, and clamps laid out like a surgeon's tools after a long operation. Captain Ellis, a Harvard-trained mechanical engineer, circled the gun with a skeptical look. "So you're telling me, Sergeant, that this contraption let you sustain continuous fire for how long?" 10 minutes and 12 seconds, Avery said flatly. "Didn't melt, didn't seize, didn't cook off a single round." The captain raised an eyebrow. 10 minutes? That's not cooling, that's witchcraft." Avery just shrugged. "Call it what you want, sir." "It worked." Ellis leaned in, examining the pitted steel and scorched paint. "You used a ration can and a hose off a deuce-and-a-half truck?" "Had to improvise. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. Just keep the gun alive." Over the next few days, the engineers tried to replicate his setup. They ran the M2 in controlled bursts, measuring temperature, airflow, and water loss. Every test ended the same way. The rig held steady while the barrel's temperature hovered below failure point. It wasn't elegant, but it was genius. Within a week, rumors of Avery's design had spread through the camp. Some soldiers called it the Thirsty Madus. Others dubbed it Avery's Miracle. Pilots flying supply drops claimed they could hear that distinctive thumping roar, echoing through the valleys long after the battle ended. But the military brass wasn't so quick to celebrate. One colonel reviewed the report and frowned. "If a sergeant in the field can solve our overheating issue with a coffee can, what does that say about our procurement department?" Still, field units began quietly adopting his method. Infantry mechanics rigged up similar systems using fuel lines, canteens, even helmet liners. It became a kind of underground innovation, passed from platoon to platoon, never officially recognized but widely trusted. Months later, Avery was summoned to a forward operating base in the Philippines. The Army wanted him to demonstrate his rig before a panel of ordnance officers. Under the tropical sun, he set up the same battered M2, filled the can with water, and loaded the belt. When the range officer gave the signal, Avery pressed the trigger and didn't let go. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5. The weapon's deep, percussive beat echoed off the hills. Steam hissed gently from the hose like breath from a sleeping giant. At 10 minutes, the crowd was dead silent. At 12, Avery lifted his finger. The major in charge walked up, felt the barrel with a gloved hand, and muttered, "Damn thing's barely warm." They never officially credited Avery for his invention. But before the war's end, modified cooling systems began appearing on gun trucks and fixed emplacements. His field fix saved countless lives and kept countless weapons in the fight. Avery himself never boasted. In letters home, he mentioned only that he helped the Browning catch its breath. But among the men who fought beside him, his name became something more than a signature. It became a story passed down through generations of gunners. Before we move on to what became of Sergeant Avery after the war, don't forget to subscribe for more true military stories like this, and tell me where you're watching from. When the war finally ended in 1945, Sergeant Avery shipped home like thousands of others. Gaunt, tired, and carrying more stories than medals. The jungle heat had baked into his bones, and the sound of the Browning's thunder still rang in his ears. But as the ships crossed the Pacific, he wasn't thinking about glory or parades. He was thinking about that one desperate day when a tin can and a hose had saved his men. Back home in Kansas, the world had moved on. The newspapers celebrated the atomic bomb, new jet engines, and the dawn of modern warfare. The little improvisations of the infantry didn't make headlines. Avery went back to working in his father's repair shop, fixing tractors instead of machine guns. His cooling system, the field-born miracle that kept the Madus alive, was buried in dusty after-action reports somewhere in an Army archive. But among veterans, the story refused to die. At VFW halls and American Legion bars, old gunners still told the tale. There was this one sergeant, they'd begin, crazy as hell but smart as the devil. Made a Madus run for 10 minutes straight. Steam hissing out the sides like a locomotive. The Army never gave him a medal for it, but his idea found a quiet life of its own. When the Korean War broke out just 5 years later, ordnance officers dusted off old reports and re-evaluated field solutions. And there it was, the Avery cooling rig, listed in a footnote under experimental sustained fire systems. The updated M2s used a more refined version, pressurized coolant jackets, inspired by that same coffee can concept. The principle was the same: move heat away fast enough, and the weapon lives longer. It wasn't pretty science. It was soldier science, the kind that came from sweat, danger, and sheer survival. Avery never knew his legacy had evolved. When he received a letter from an old comrade years later, a gunner stationed in Pusan, it simply read, Your trick's still keeping us alive out here. Guess you outsmarted the laws of physics again." He smiled and tucked that letter in his wallet, where it stayed for the rest of his life. By the 1960s, his small-town shop had become something of a legend itself. Younger mechanics would wander in to ask about the Browning that wouldn't quit. Avery never made a big deal about it. He'd just chuckle, lean back on his stool, and say, "Sometimes the best fix isn't in the manual." Even decades later, the US military continued to build upon what he started. Thermal dispersion systems, air cooling sleeves, and liquid-assisted heat sinks. All of them owed something to that one desperate act of innovation in a jungle long ago. Sergeant Avery never saw himself as a hero. He just did what needed doing. But history often forgets the quiet problem solvers, the men who turned impossible situations into solutions that lasted generations. Before we move on to how Avery's forgotten ingenuity came full circle in the wars that followed, make sure you're subscribed for more untold stories of the men who made history. One bolt, one battle, and one crazy idea at a time. Decades after Sergeant Avery passed away, his family found an old metal box in the attic. Inside were a few faded photographs, a Browning M2, a jungle clearing, and a dented coffee can with holes punched in the sides. Beneath them lay a folded letter yellowed with age. It was from a military historian dated 1982, thanking Avery for his field innovation that contributed to advancements in machine gun cooling design. His family had never heard of it. He had never told them. In the years since, every modern version of the Browning M2, still in service across the world, carries the DNA of Avery's ingenuity. Soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan fired those guns for hours at a time, supported by updated cooling systems born from the same raw instinct that saved lives in 1943. The legend of the gunner who made the Madus breathe like a living beast spread quietly through military lore. Some said he poured water directly onto the barrel until steam blinded him. Others swore he built a full cooling rig out of spare tank parts. The truth, as always, was simpler and far more human. He was just a man trying to keep his brothers alive, thinking faster than the heat could kill them. Today, that old machine gun still sits on tripods, Humvees, and helicopters, roaring with the same rhythm that once echoed through the Pacific jungle. But what keeps it alive isn't just steel or engineering. It's the spirit of the soldier who refused to stop firing when the world told him it couldn't be done. And somewhere out there, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear that old Browning thunder, never overheating again.